I think we've had a fabulous afternoon, thanks to all of you. Tom Wynn, you may not know what I'm talking about here, but many in the audience will when I say you tell of archaeology, which is to say you're everywhere, full of ideas. 2 or 3 times we've talked about your book today, How to Think Like a Neanderthal, which you wrote with your colleague Frederick Coolidge at University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. And it was reviewed in the New York Times very favorably. It explained that Neanderthals were companionable and they were family-oriented. They were a little xenophobic, sometimes cannibalistic, which doesn't sound very companionable to me. The interesting thing is they made spearheads. Rather well, they could kill a mammoth with a spearhead, but that's about all they made. Is that right? Why is that? Did they make other things?
No, they made a whole huge variety of other artifacts. That's just the one we used as an example of their technological expertise.
But they were very expert. They could even attach them to a stick.
Sure, sure. In fact, they were very good at that.
With bitumen and with lashing?
Right, correct.
All right, that's good. Well, now the question is, here they were bigger than Homo sapiens, which is our gang, and yet we won. What happened to them? Why?
I could get in a lot of trouble answering that question.
Are you saying there's some Neanderthals here in this room?
Oh, well, actually, genetically, almost certainly there are people with Neanderthal genes out in the audience and probably up on the stage.
You know, I want to tell you one. Do any of you know Pat Rosenthal? She's the Undermain Theater on the board of the opera. She went through the rigmarole of finding out her ancestry, and she does have some Neanderthal in her. She's very able.
I would guess most of you have a little bit. So.
But why did they lose?
Well, Fred and I think that modern humans had a very slight advantage in terms of their planning abilities. And that allowed them to organize much larger social groups. And integrating larger social groups, they simply outcompeted Neanderthals when they invaded Europe. Basically, we stole Europe from the Neanderthals.
Some say we stole the New World.
Yes, we've been doing it for probably 100,000 years.
Well, you also wrote in your book that they just didn't adapt to these new spears that the Homo sapiens could make, the spearheads. And the Ice Age came and it wiped out some of their prey and they had to adjust to new food. And then they had competitors with that food and they just retreated to Spain.
Right, right. At least archaeologically, that seems to have been what happened. You have to remember the archaeological and the paleontological record is pretty spotty, and we connect the dots a lot. So when we get new finds, that allows us to see things with a little more precision. But it does appear that after modern humans arrived, there was a little bit of interbreeding with Neanderthals, but eventually we simply outcompeted them, and that's why they're not with us.
Leanne, I have, as a result of this project, started reading a book called Sapiens. It's by Yuval Noah Harari. He's at the University of, the Hebrew University with you, Naama. Yes. And he says that there is a scientist at Harvard named George Church who has been following the Neanderthal Genome Project, which you probably know all about, and he thinks it might be an interesting idea to reconstruct DNA from this project and create another Neanderthals, bring them back. I'm not kidding. There are also some scientists working on a mammoth. They have a mammoth fetus, they've implanted in an elephant, and before long they'll have a mammoth again. Can you imagine something like this with the Neanderthal? Would you do this at the Brain Center?
It's a funding issue. No, I'm just kidding.
Look, $30 million. He said he for $30 million.
Wow, that is exciting. It would really be interesting to be able to start looking at cognitive tests, comparing behaviorally, but also...
That's what they want to do.
Yeah, doing that imaging and seeing what parts of their brain react differently to different stimuli. Man, bring it on. I would love to see that happen.
Well, now, let me ask you something else.
This is a moral issue.
But you're right.
This is a moral issue.
The ethical issue is, yeah.
You're right.
Do that.
You're right, of course. That's true. Leanne thinks so, too.
Yeah, actually, I do.
And Leanne, Tom Wynn, who is everywhere, as I said, has said that actually we are not adapted, all of us. We're really Stone Age people, and we're not well adapted to the modern world, to the stresses of the modern world. We would rather be sitting on a hilltop bagging rocks together. Do you think that's true?
I think, to be fair, our environments have changed so quickly in the last 1,000 years that we could not possibly have kept up in adapting to the changes. So more has happened in the last, I would say 100 years, but certainly the last 1,000 years in terms of our environment changing than probably happened 100,000 years prior. And so evolution doesn't happen on that scale. And so no, we're not really caught up to the world that we're living in. So that is affecting us in terms of, we have these technologies, and our brains are not necessarily, we don't really even understand how the technologies are affecting our brain. The amount of information that we get on a daily basis is more than ever before by gigabytes, to use a modern term. And so our brains they are ancient brains relative to the environment that we have today, and that is creating challenges for us, and it's creating health issues. The stresses we have today, I think, are related to that.
Tony, you don't seem to have any health issues. You have all these wonderful artifacts that you surround yourself with. Freud used to have some antiquities on his desk. They weren't as old as yours, of course, but they were very nice. And he thought that they gave him access to the unconscious. What about these Handaxes you've collected? Do they give you access to some part of yourself that might heretofore otherwise be obscured?
Well, I think that the greatest, for an artist, usually the greatest influences are totally unconscious. And people like to hear an explanation of the story. And if people have written about artists, they usually crib from that. It's called Explain Yourself. But actually, it's a big mystery art. And it's a big mystery why people can be extraordinarily great and then just lose it. It's hard to know. And I decided a long time ago that my fascination, my unconditional fascination with these things I didn't have to worry about whether it was good for me or not.
Well,
that's the thing that artists claim, along with the privilege of not having to wear a tie.
You have a friend.
But we can also, we don't have to be exactly lineal, and that we can just respond to what we feel like doing on any given day. Hopefully.
And we can turn off the frontal lobe no matter what Leanne says.
We do. We just shouldn't.
You have a friend, Tony, named Stephen LeBlanc, who used to run the Peabody Museum of Anthropology, or Archaeology, I should say, and Ethnology at Harvard. And the two of you were together in Los Angeles. The LA Times interviewed you in your studio. Mm-hmm. And Stephen said that you really lead from intuition, that when you're looking at Handaxes and trying to figure out which ones were made by the same person, and you do really want a relationship with that person, you go with intuition. And he didn't use these words, but he says it makes an archaeologist crazy. How did they feel when you were at Frank's house?
They're not crazy enough, is the problem. From my point of view, they're too involved with winning the argument. From my point
you don't
of view.
mean Tom.
And Steve and I were involved not with Ancient Man, but with the Southwest.
And the Hopi.
Membrace painted ceramics. We had the great pleasure of forming the Membrace Foundation together. But no, it's a great mystery, the kind of overlap between art being a social manifestation, which it is, in a specific time and place, and the stew of all the different individuals who come together and color each other and make things happen. One individual doesn't do it. I mean, there was only one Picasso, but he wouldn't have been Picasso
without
if he
Matisse.
wasn't surrounded by all these other people.
Richard, all roads lead back to Tom Wynn. He has said some things about creativity. He's talking about craftsmanship, and I wonder if, as an artist, you think he makes some sense. He said creativity occurs in this way, either deviation from the norm, that is a procedural drift. You take your usual method and you vary it a bit, serendipitous mistake, or just fiddling around. Do you find that does this produce creativity for you or for craftspeople?
Okay, I think fiddling around is important. I think competence is important. And I think we're discussing, I think competence and curiosity are the two key things here. We're discussing various versions of hominids who have extraordinary competence in a material technology. They can, and therefore they're comfortable in their environment because they have that competence. And that competence permits a curiosity to arise, and that curiosity may be expressed in terms of gigantism, or merely wondering what something else looks like, the pebbles up to, kind of being but competence gives a certain kind of level of comfort in relationship to the environment, and that level of confidence leads to a curiosity. And the curiosity leads to fiddling around, and fiddling around leads to invention. That would be how I express it.
Now, Tom makes a distinction between invention and innovation. Do you?
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily. And Tom would have to tell me what he thought what the difference was between invention and innovation.
What is the difference in your view?
It's just a semantic difference. Innovation is the production of anything novel. So the appearance of any novel phenomenon is an innovation. But invention is the conscious attempt to produce
a better version.
An innovation. It turns out I thought that was a perfectly acceptable distinction, but that business schools use just the opposite definition. So please don't all go out and quote me on that, because that's just the distinction that I make in my writing.
Richard, Tom, and Naama, in their piece in the catalog, talked about the making of cleavers in GBY in Israel. And they had to be done quite exactly, they said. The angles had to be right and the strokes had to be right. And it had to be done according to the tradition. And it raised for me the question, were they aware they were working within a tradition, do you think?
Yeah, because if not, they couldn't have made the tool. Because you can hit the stone in the wrong place with the wrong hammer, with the wrong angle, and you'll never reach a stage that you'll have an end product which will be a cleaver. And there will be lots of rejects, which we don't find. So we do think that the people who made the cleavers and the Handaxes were experts and not novices,
So if you hit it in the wrong place then, you've had a trial and you've made an error, and is that what sends you back to the right road?
Well, it's a process of learning, of course, but the learning probably took quite a number of years before the individuals were able to produce what we found at the site.
Yes, Richard.
Yeah, in the box grove material, like I said, there are bad items. There are botched efforts, which are clearly related to learning. That someone's trying to do it, and some is learning how to do it, and they mess it up. So
we often think somehow in prehistory that there were no children. It's as if there were simply...
How is that possible, Tom? How is that possible?
Yeah. So
we also think there were no women. I mean, where were the women? Anybody here? I mean, Naama, you should know.
What? Women. There, yes, we think that they were. We have some kind of indirect evidence for that, because there's a lot of gathering which was done. And if you look at ethnographic societies today, women and the old and children are usually responsible for gathering the nuts and the fruits and the other things and small animals. And the adult males are engaged with the hunting of the large animals. So we have very large animals like rhinos, like elephants, two different families of elephants, very big bovids and everything, and yet we have a lot of nuts and fruits and other things. So, and we have some kind of installations that you can see that they were working around hearths, as I explained in the communication. So perhaps we can see something which is similar to present-day configuration, where the females and the youngsters are in the camp, and the males are going for longer distances and responsible for either driving the big elephants to the locality or killing other and processing other larger animals.
You and Tom wrote a piece about hunter-gatherers This may be the one in the catalog. And you said that they did eat fruits and nuts and seeds and vegetables and root vegetables. Sounded quite vegan until they got going with the animals, and they killed amphibians and turtles and sometimes horses, maybe even an elephant. You showed us an elephant in
Lots
your
of elephants.
skull. And but you said this was your piece, and I'm quoting you, I think exactly, they had a particular fondness for the fallow deer.
Yeah.
Now, how do you know about that fondness?
Because the number of individuals of this particular animal is much higher than any of the others. We can say that they were fond of several types of animals, the elephants, the hippo, the cervids, this fallow deer. These were the prime interest of the medium and large animals.
John, you wrote about Lucian language, and language seems to pop up from time to time. There was a CBS report about a study, I think it was University of California at Berkeley. They had some students make some Handaxes and not speak and took a vow of silence. Others could speak. And they concluded that the ones who could speak did better. But it didn't really make, I mean, Tom said this makes no sense at all. And he maintains that language was not a part of the making of Handaxes. What do you think? I hope I quoted you correctly.
Close.
Sort of. Good. All right. Well, that's very kind of you. You can say, go ahead, Jonathan. He can say what he really meant.
I think I probably favor a slow evolution of something like language. But I've got to take into account that I'm working with colleagues like Robin Dunbar, who thinks that laughter is a really important part along the line. Maybe you have laughter before you have language like we know it. Maybe you have singing before you have language like we know it. And Robin always stresses the gossip side of language, that it is social grooming more than saying, this is the way you make a Handaxe. But I always think, too, that it would be quite useful to be able to say, this is the way you make a Handaxe. And because they make Handaxes so well, and they keep the knowledge going in the same way from so far back, I wouldn't really be surprised if there was a simple kind of language from, well, more than 1 million years ago. But at the same time, it might not be the kind of language that we think of as language. It might be much simpler in the way it operates.
Well, you talk about something called a semantic cue in
Right.
creativity, and I never understood what that is. It's instruction.
Right. A semantic cue would simply be a word or even a gesture that elicits a long-term memory, a very complicated long-term memory. So the example I like to use is chess, if any of you play chess, and somebody says King's Indian Defense, that's a cue. And if you know what that is, that pulls up the position of all the pieces on the board and where they are on the board. So basically you have a small piece of information that is linked to a much larger piece of information, and that's what we mean by a cue.
But it is not necessarily spoken language. It
Not
could be
necessarily,
something
no.
else. John, this is a question that really was triggered by something I read about Tony. For 15 years, he lived in Ocean Park, California. It was a remarkable neighborhood. Within a 6-mile radius, I'm quoting you from that Los Angeles piece, Los Angeles Times, he had Richard Diebenkorn, Sam Francis, James Turrell, who introduced you to Stephen LeBlanc, and we have a story about him at the Nasher, but we won't go into that. But the question is, did they have these kinds of communities in the era that you've been studying? Any sense of community? Or were they just in a state of nature and they hadn't discovered John Locke's social contract?
I think what the social brain idea, which is basically Robin Dunbar's and Leslie Aiello's idea, what it really does is try and explain our big brain, which is so expensive. I mean, we're carrying around a brain that's about twice as big or more than it should be for if you were an ape. And so what is it about? And it seems living a more complex social life is the requirement. And if you can read off community sizes, then a chimpanzee or a gorilla probably doesn't know more than 60 other individuals and stay with them. And we're up into hundreds, 150, maybe
200 more.
And these are maybe the big societies, and maybe they were bigger for modern humans. So that's possibly where the Neanderthals lost out in the end, that they couldn't organize in the same way. So I guess it doesn't explain everything, and language probably goes with it very strongly as well. But maybe you need these bigger groups even to organize making handaxes and make sure the knowledge survives and goes along.
I thought
yes,
Neanderthal
Richard.
brains were bigger than Homo sapiens brains.
You're right. They argue that the proportions of the bits of the brain are different, and that this favors
So
us.
it's not just size.
And not just size.
What part's bigger?
Naama, you did some work at Kaiser Hill, which is where hunter-gathering apparently started to give way to farming. Of course, Kaiser Hill turned out to be rather urban. I saw a photograph of your dig there. There's some mid-rise buildings quite close by. It's on the outskirts of a city near Jerusalem, and I have to say it kind of reminded me of that time a few years ago when Richard III was dug up in a parking lot in Leicester. Well, you know what? My word, that was.
Long-term parking.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I would have to say you're right. I mean, think of the winters of his discontent. But anyway, you wrote, I think, rather eloquently that it brought about a different relationship with nature. The advent of farming. How would you describe that new relationship with nature?
Well, the site is an Neolithic site, and it's a particular type of site. It's a quarry. So the extensive work that was done in the quarry necessitates a large group working together and processing, because there is a lot of strategy with where you start and how you go about it, what do you do with the waste. But this is really very, very far away. This is something like 9,000 years ago, very far away from the Handaxes and everything.
Why don't we have some questions from all of you or comments? Yes. Yeah, Pat, I can't see very well, but I recognize your voice just like Tony said I would.
When they work, thank you all for this fascinating afternoon. I didn't know I was interested in this until I walked in. But, why did they need so many Handaxes? When you look at how complicated it was to make one for the people who did it well, why did they need hundreds and hundreds? Did they wear out as you used them, so they made more? Were there people selling them for? What was going on there?
Like, I go for it. I think it's partly that they're so useful that they keep making them, and then if you discard it, it doesn't go away. It probably stays around for a long time, and maybe they're cheap. You know, maybe we do similar things too. So there are a lot, and I think it is puzzling. But at the same time, we can try and explain it and say that, well, if you make 3 or 4 a year and you keep coming back to the same place and so on, then maybe in the end an archaeologist will come along and we'll find hundreds. So it could be that.
Perhaps, you know, one of the ideas is that these tools were used to cut masses of meat of large animals. And it's quite difficult, you know. You have to stock yourself in a way. Because, okay, you know the trail of the elephant, but you don't know exactly when the elephant is going to show up. If the elephant is going to show up in 10 minutes because somebody told you, I think they had full language, but that's a different issue. Okay, what are you going to do? You cannot grab a big basalt slab, start making a core. It would take you, you know, several hours sometimes. So you have to equip yourself in such a manner that once you know that somebody tells you that the big animal is coming up, and you, a small group can hunt it, but a larger group has to work on it. Because A single person can hunt an elephant, but a single person cannot process the elephant. It needs a much larger group of people to work on it.
Yes, Richard.
Boxgrove was occupied for perhaps 20 years. There are 350 Handaxes. If you occupy a site for 1,000 years, then simple math tells you there'll be a lot more Handaxes. It's the function of time that's difficult for us to understand. This is an extraordinarily successful group that occupied areas of ground for 100,000 years. And it's that time thing which gives you quantity on the ground, I think, primarily.
So why didn't they just use the ones that were already there? Why did they keep making?
Because you have to keep the technique alive.
Well, you know, Jane Jacobs had a theory about that.
Yeah.
You all know her. She wrote The Death and Life of American Cities, great cities. But she also did some inquiry into this as a gifted amateur. And she said that in hunter-gatherer societies, the women did all the work, as you just said, and the men, of course, were out hunting, but they couldn't do that all day, so they would whittle, and they would make things, perhaps these Handaxes.
Well,
and she said it's still that way. And
I didn't get that.
and she said only those societies succeed where men take over women's work and begin to get involved in the real work of the village. But that's just Jane Jacobs. But is there another question? Yes, right there.
I heard the word handedness used only once. Is there evidence for left-handed napping? Could there possibly be evidence for left-handed napping?
Who wants to take that? You want to take it, John?
I'm sure we can say other things about that. The asymmetry in a lot of them would suggest that they are probably used preferentially in one hand rather than another. The studies that have been done systematically on that are, well, it's quite hard to clinch things. It looks as if there are both left-handed and right-handed individuals around. Natalie Uomini has sort of suggested that maybe the right-handedness goes back a long time.
But the experimental work has been largely inconclusive. There's some indication that Nick Toth argued several decades ago that there was preferential right-handedness in flake production 1.5 million years ago. But when someone tried to duplicate the experiment, didn't get the same results. So if you can't duplicate the results, then you have to be a little suspicious of what the conclusions are. My guess is handedness is probably fairly ancient. It's generally associated with language because language is generally located in the left brain. But how that link works, no one has ever been able to actually play out in any convincing way. I don't know, Dr. Young, do you have any insights into handedness that can help us out?
Not many. It's not an area of my expertise. You're right about the association with language. The Broca region is associated with language, and most of the time it's on the left side. For some left-handed individuals, it's actually located on the right side. So there is an association, but it's not my expertise, so I'm afraid to hypothesize and really mess it up.
No. So
Okay.
there you are.
Anybody else? Yes, right back there. Right.
Over the years, I've talked to Tony about many things, almost everything. But one thing that we discussed that I think bears on this, which is very interesting to me, you talked about Mimbre's culture. In fact, it was a small culture with perhaps just a few people making the great pots. And my question is, do we think that there was that kind of division of labor at that point, that people who were really showed great skill at making hand axes would do that primarily and let other people hunt? Is there that kind of, any sense that there is that kind of division of labor?
Naama has something, maybe Tony will too then.
From ethnographic encounters, we are aware of the fact that sometimes when people make bifaces, particularly in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, the experts are dealing with the toughest material, with the most difficult rocks. and the others could deal with other types of rocks. So there is a segregation between the degree of expertise vis-a-vis the final products.
Richard and then Tony?
The Boxgrove site again, the horse butchery, from the excavation at the site. So the animals lying there in the mud, they send off people to the cliff to get nodules to come back. And they rough out the Handaxes, but the debitage, the fragments, indicate that the rough core is then passed to another individual because the fine flaking is done just not close to it, but adjacent to it. So it's as if there's a guy roughing it out and then passing it to somebody else to finish it off.
An assembly
so
line.
there's some. So the answer to the question is that there is a division of labour there, there's organisation, and apparently, so that's a conclusion that you can seem to draw from the debitage on the floor.
Tony, anything to add?
Well, just the Mimbres culture, which was mentioned, it had maybe a population of 6,000 people, and the period of time that they made the things were maybe 250 years, and you find a very high level of competence and the great variety of competence in Handaxes suggests, and also those that we don't find aesthetically pleasing could be functionally just as effective. But about the reason of why keep making Handaxes, why keep making paintings? And if you want paintings, all you have to do is go down to the Salvation Army.
No, you go to the Tally Dunn Gallery down the side, and there's where his work will be.
You don't have to go to the Tally Dunn.
And it's not Salvation Army prices,
You can
I'm
just
sure.
go get this thing, and you're honoring the person who made it. And it's weird about artworks. It's like having your dog. How attached you become to a dog. People become really attached. Somebody brought a terrible painting to me recently that they wanted to restore it. And it's going to cost, it's not worth anything, and it's cost a lot of money to restore, but they've had it for 40 years, and they've become, I think I'm sort of going afield here, but...
What did you tell them?
I asked them, well, how much an hour do you make? And they're a very skillful surgeon, and they told me, and I said, get it fixed. You know, it's your pet. It's part of your history. It's something that you've lived with, and you remember the circumstances you got it with, and you can recognize. I mean, I hadn't thought about this, but if you've taught even your most terrible student in terms of skill in a university extension course, I can recognize a work by them anywhere, anytime I see it. And that's why I think people wanted to have, it was a different thing to have beholding your own Handaxe. If you follow my intuition, that it's a manifestation of self. And so I think you want to make that yourself because it tells you that you exist and it tells others that you exist.
Well, Peter Stewart brought a Handaxe today. I don't know if he's still here. He found it in West Texas. It's small. It fits in the palm of his hand, and it's quite wonderful. I just wanted to mention, I hope you don't mind this, John. I want to quote you. We were talking the other night, and I couldn't resist asking him about Brexit. He has very good insights, and I venture the observation that Theresa May reminds me of a character from Tennessee Williams, and a question about her was this: and what is the victory of a cat on a hot tin roof? The answer, to stay on just as long as she can. Well, but John said, yes, she is strong in her weakness. So I think we are talking today about people, the Neanderthals, all the others who were strong in their weakness, and we owe them more than we realize. And we owe all of you more than we realize, too. So thanks for being here. And Anna, back to you.
I just want to give you an anecdote.
Okay.
When I arrived in Dallas-Fort Worth Airport 3 days ago, going through immigration control, the officer says to me, "What are you here for?" And I said, I'm on business. I'm here for an exhibition opening. Oh, he says, what sort? I said, oh, it's a sculpture exhibition. Oh, what sort? I said, oh, it's some old stuff. Stone things. So he said, oh, you mean marble? I said, no, actually they're more flint than marble. He said, flint? I said, yeah, these are really old. They're kind of Paleolithic objects. He says, Handaxe. He says, now you're talking. I got a really nice scraper I found up in the Black Hills 5 years ago.
Well, but he's remembering the American television show called The Flintstones. So there are always connections everywhere. Anna?
Thank you all so much for joining us today. I invite you to join us for just a little longer in a wine reception where you're welcome to chat amongst yourselves and with our panel. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you.